Welcome back to 2.5 Hours. I'm Brian Becker. We're here in Freedom Plaza with the Occupy movement. It's been here since October 6th, demanding peace, demanding social equality, demanding economic justice. It's part of a movement that's spreading all across the country and indeed around the world. We're joined here in Freedom Plaza by Professor Carolyn Gallagher. She's with American University, and Tony Travis from George Mason University, and with the people from the occupation movement right here in Freedom Plaza. Now, down the street, we have the Capitol building where 535 members of the U.S. Congress meet infrequently, but they make basic policies about the issues that are driving this movement. And just 2 blocks west of here is the White House. So we're at a very strategic, pivotal place. Carolyn Gallagher, I want to ask you, when you see this new movement, some people say it's not a movement, it's a moment, that it's just a passing fad. What do you think?
I don't think that people that are living here for over a month could be considered just a moment. I think this is stronger than a moment. I think it's a movement. And
what's driving it? What are the underlying issues from your point of view?
Well, I think in any social movement, you have to be careful not to say there's just one thing that drives the movement. But I think corporate greed is a big initial driver. I think the fact that we had a recession that began in 2008 and it's not over, and there seems to be very little political will by Democrats or Republicans to do anything about it, it's opening the door for people to say enough is enough.
Tony Travis, I want to ask you about political will and people's expectations. Just 2.5 years ago, maybe almost 3 years ago now, President Obama came to office. This mall, this area was surrounded by millions of people, tremendous optimism, a sense of euphoria. Not only was Bush leaving, but the Bush era was perhaps ending. And yet today people are in the streets. Unemployment is high, more uninsured, more foreclosed. Have people become disappointed in the political process?
I think disappointed and disillusioned, but there's this understanding gap, I think, that they thought Obama could do it all. He could do it with the help of Congress. And Congress has said no on some of these issues of redistribution in terms of the tax code and some other things that would, so to speak, tax the rich more or penalize them in some way. And they've said no new taxes on anyone.
Well, let me ask you both that. I mean, the Democrats say that the Republicans are obstinate, that they're just trying to drag their feet. They're the party of no. They're saying no to anything that President Obama has proposed. But President Obama has not proposed anything like what FDR proposed in the 1930s, a massive jobs program, not a kind of program to keep foreclosed families in their homes. What accounts for the timidity of the Democratic Party?
Well, I think that if you look at it structurally, the Democratic Party has gotten weaker and weaker as the union movement has gotten weaker and weaker. And if you look at the percentage of the population that was in a union in 1970, and then you look at it in 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010, the percentage of people that are in unions has declined every single decade. So there's no sort of institutional framework to really push forward progressive ideals. And so whenever I'm watching TV and I hear a Republican, for example, on the news talking about how the unions are ruining our political system, it's sort of comical because the union movement is so small. There isn't a sort of big vehicle for the people that are still working that would have been in unions to really have a voice and a way to collectively address their problems.
Well, I want to come back to that question about the Democratic Party's will or desire, or the fact that its base, presumably in the case of the labor movement, has gotten weaker. Certainly in the last 35 years, the number of people in unions, in private sector unions, has shrunk dramatically, 7% as opposed to 30% a few decades ago who are now in unions. But nonetheless, the Democrats had the presidency. They had a very big majority in the House of Representatives, a very big majority in the Senate. And yet, when the health care bill came up, none of them would put, say, single-payer health plan even on the agenda, in spite of the fact that most of the American people said, and according to the polls, that they wanted it. Is the Democratic Party tied to the insurance companies and the banks, or is it just willpower?
I think it's even bigger than that. I mean, go back to when Bill Clinton was president. I mean, this is the president who's a Democrat who declared the era of big government as over. So the Democrats have given up being the party of workers and producers and the bottom 50% of the population, let alone the bottom 95% of the population. So that started long before Obama even got to office. So the party, the DNC, the infrastructure of the party, their base is in many respects the same as the base of the Republican Party, which is corporations. I mean, also go back to Bill Clinton, he introduced NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Whether you like it or not, the people that lost out of NAFTA were primarily people that worked in factory jobs. That was a classic constituency of the Democratic Party. If the party that generally represents them decides to sort of let that go the way of the Republicans, then they don't really have a leg to stand on. They don't have any institutional backing for this. They've basically come into a general agreement about the economic fate of the country.
Tony Travis, I want to pick up on something that Carolyn mentioned, that Bill Clinton, the Democrat who was president in 1996, said we want to end the era of big government. Now, they weren't talking about reducing the military spending. They were talking about eliminating welfare for maybe 7 million children in the United States. And a lot of people thought then that the Democrats were just becoming Republicans. In other words, the differentiation between the Democrats and the Republicans, while still in existence, was becoming less and less, and that, in fact, the Democrats were adopting the Republican program. Do you see it that way?
Well, I think it's very hard, as Carolyn said, that the two parties are very similar, and the big problem is where they get their money. And they're getting their money from corporations as well as Wall Street. And this is why Obama can't take certain steps now, because he doesn't want to do anything that will discourage people from giving to his campaign so he can be reelected.
Well, okay, let's go back to the movement that we see here in Freedom Plaza, in Zuccotti Park, in downtown Lower Manhattan, in Chicago, in Oakland. In fact, all over the country, people are saying that the Democrats and the Republicans are basically one and the same, that there's a plutocracy. What you're suggesting is that a government of, by, and for money.
There's not much difference between the two parties now, and that's part of the problem, yes.
Okay, so what options then do people have? I mean, do you feel, given the fact that we've just gone through what was considered a historic campaign with the election of President Obama, not only was the first black man elected president, but the sentiment, the feelings that you could sense all around the country that now was the time for change. And if it doesn't happen through the electoral arena, isn't it somewhat inevitable that people then start to take matters into their own hands? And does the Occupy movement mean that?
Well, I think it means that, but I also think it just means that there's such disillusionment with the parties as they are right now that the only way that you can really sort of shake the system and get the larger attention is to do something like this. And if you go back and look at the Tea Party moment, which was, a couple of years ago, and it was on the other side of the political spectrum, just by, getting it up in people's faces and getting on TV and making a point, a lot of people would argue that they shifted the balance in terms of the discourse about, for example, what we were going to do with healthcare. So I think this movement, however long it lasts, has a potential to be very important because it changes the conversation. That doesn't change the structural problems which are there and are not going to go away until they are the structure of how campaigns are financed, for example, is fixed. But it does change the conversation. And it's amazing to me that we are, 3 years past a recession and things have not gotten better, and there seems to be very little urgency by either party to do anything meaningful that would really take care of this. So I think, there's disillusionment. Of course people are going to come out and do something about it, and this is just an example of that.
I think it's more than just a conversation. I think it's going to change the agenda. I think it's going to change what's going to be at the top and the most important problem. But to go back to Obama a minute, I think part of the problem is that he doesn't have, so to speak, control of his party or Congress. They're removing earmarks from the process. He doesn't have anything to bargain with. He wasn't in Congress that long to have the IOUs that Lyndon Baines Johnson had with the Civil Rights era bills. He doesn't have that kind of clout in that legislative body, I think, to get what he would like to get passed.
Since you mentioned the Civil Rights Movement and Lyndon Baines Johnson and making a comparison about both what's similar and what's different about this new movement, Of course, in the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, or the Voting Rights Act was passed in 65, there were millions of people in the streets. There was a crusade, a people's revolution sweeping first the southern states and then into the north. Of course, it all starts small. What's the comparison, Carolyn, between this movement and, say, the movement of the 1960s? First, there was the civil rights movement, then, of course, the student anti-war movement. But are there parallels? Are there differences?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is be respectful to every movement and say every movement is its own movement. And when you hear people saying, well, you know, the people in Zuccotti Park or Occupy Oakland or Freedom Plaza in D.C. are a bunch of hippies, you know, what they're doing is they're trying to dismiss it to say, well, this is something that's in the past. And I think there may be people that are here that are from that era, but this is its own movement. I also think this movement, while it's certainly the wars are a big issue for them, I don't think that's the motivating or sort of central factor. So it's its own movement. And I think just thinking about the timing of when this movement started, we had the biggest recession since the Great Recession in the 30s. This is a movement that stems out of the various concerns that come out of the fact that lots of people lost their homes, they had their savings wiped out, they're in more insecure places in their lives, and that is not the same thing as what was going on in the 60s. So again, there may be some comparisons, but this is a unique movement and it's its own movement.
Very economically based. I mean, you've got college students who have no idea if they will get a job when they graduate. How are they going to pay off these debts? And at the other end of the spectrum, age-wise, you've got people saying, don't cut my Medicaid. You know, I'm living on Social Security. So the economic strain is very clear in this movement.
I want to talk about the young people and how the economic problems of today affect young people. You're both university professors, American University and George Mason University, so you're in contact with students. The aggregate amount of student debt in this country is about $1 trillion. That's debt that's owed to the banks. These same banks were bailed out through the Troubled Asset Relief Program in 2008. They were bailed out to the tune of $680 billion besides loan guarantees. Do you feel that the loan issue for students is not only driving the protests forward, but also require like significant far-reaching reform? Do you see this as one of the things coming out of the movement?
I think so. I mean, I was at the McPherson Square, Occupy DC, a couple of weeks ago, and there were a lot of students there who were talking about their student loan debt. And the problem is, if you have $20,000 in debt and you can't get a job, or you can get a job that's going to pay you slightly over minimum wage, you could be paying these debts when you're 60. And that's assuming that you have a low debt load. I mean, a lot of my students, because it's a private university, they have debt loads that are over $100,000. And so if you don't get that kind of job that's going to pay you well enough to pay these debts off, you're talking about dying with debt. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. My generation, when I went to college, my debts were paid off from college. It took me 10 years, but I paid them off. These guys are looking at debts that could go on for 40, 50 years. And the one debt you cannot easily escape is your student loan debt. Sally Mae will enact her payment.
The banks shielded themselves from having students declare bankruptcy on student loans. I mean, that was a gift to the banks.
Yes.
You're at two different kinds of universities. American University is the student demographic is more well-to-do, more middle class or upper middle class. George Mason University, I would guess, is more middle class and working class.
Yes.
How are students handling the loan issue where you are?
Well, they're scared to death because I think if it were just student debt, that would be one issue. But it's student debt and no prospect of a job. Unless you're in computer science, maybe you're engineering, which the Northern Virginia economy can absorb. But not if you're an English major, history major. You know, previously maybe these people got a job in a bank or entry level somewhere. Now they're not finding any jobs.
So we have a situation where students can't pay their loans back because they don't have jobs, and they don't have jobs because the country's in a recession. And the recession was caused by the banks' greed, and yet people still have to pay their student loans back to the banks. I mean, that's a circle that's kind of apparent. And I'm wondering, now the movement's just in its early stage. Do you see it becoming a radical movement, like not just an activist movement, but similar to some of the sort of radical movements of the 1930s that ended up with strong socialist communist, anarchist currents because the target was the banks and corporations. Do you see that, Carolyn?
Well, I think that in every movement on the left and the right, you have people that are sort of on the edges or the fringes that are willing to take it in a violent direction. But those fringes can't define.
I don't mean violent. I mean politically radical. I mean, in other words,
I would say that socialism isn't politically radical. I mean, you know, it tells you a lot about the poverty of our discourse that we think socialism is radical. I mean, the welfare state is not radical, and that is socialist in form. You know, go to Europe, and of course Europe has its own debt crisis right now, but you know, taking care of your elderly and taking care of poor children is not radical. So if you want to call socialism radical, then what you're saying is that taking care of your elderly and your poor children is radical, and I disagree with that.
Well, I think you may have touched a nerve, and we want to be able to hear from people who are here in Freedom Plaza, who are camping out. I'm going to get my signal in a second for that, but I want to talk again about the issue of socialism, meaning an encroachment on the private property rights of the banks. Like right now, the bankers who have been bailed out and who are insisting that students pay their loans are also giving themselves big bonuses.
Oh, aren't they?
They're giving themselves big bonuses. 5,000 bankers got $1 million bonus last year for their so-called good work, and the students yet have to pay the loans back. So I'm wondering, when I say radical and socialist, I mean, is it going to be targeting the institutions of capitalism themselves?
I think that's what it's got to do, don't you? Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, no, I'll let you go, and then.
Well, I think it must become more focused in order to sustain itself. The civil rights movement was very focused and very disciplined in the nonviolent dimension, but this movement has got to become more focused. A leader will emerge or something, and for it to sustain and continue.
Okay, we're gonna start to get some input here from the people who are actually in Freedom Plaza day in and day out and who are making this movement happen. Sir, can you identify yourself and ask your question?
Yes, my name is Tom Midland. I'm from Vermont, and I'm the cook here. So, you guys brought up the issues about radicalism in the 1930s and 20s and such. Okay, so what I've been noticing more and more over the past 2 years are all the uprisings that have been going on all over the world. And not only that, but citizens and civilians of those nations rising up against their government. Okay, and then after looking at this for about a year and a half and seeing all this, I see an article on Yahoo Internet that said the main heading was that the U.S. government financed internet services to the Middle East, to the peoples of the Middle East, for the purposes of creating an uprising. Now, we don't know that for sure. I mean, it could be a conspiracy, but we should not always reject conspiracies categorically. But my question is, if it is so, then who's to say that this higher structure of power is not doing something here and taking an advantage of our indifference towards Wall Street and our government here right now, And so this has got me really concerned.
Okay, let's ask our guests. So the issue is the meddling, the intervention by the U.S. government, both in the Middle East and Europe and perhaps here. It speaks directly to the question of what is the Obama administration thinking about and doing with this movement. In the public pronouncements, it makes it appear that President Obama wants to sort of show solidarity with the movement, but perhaps not. What do you think, Carolyn?
Well, I think he's walking a fine line because, again, as you said, he's worried about his corporate sponsors, as every candidate is. But I think the worry there is, again, the poverty of the discourse, that we can think about that we can view our social net as somehow radical, and that so many people across the political spectrum can sort of buy into that logic. He's treading very carefully about making connections to the movement because I think he could himself be labeled radical. And of course, he's already been labeled radical when, I think a lot of people would see Obama and think he's a pretty moderate Republican.
Okay, let's go right back to the people here in back to the people in Freedom Plaza. Sir, can you identify yourself and ask your question?
Yes, my first name is spelled M-I-L-L, last name Butler. You had mentioned that some students choose computer science or some other field, but those jobs are going overseas. I'd like you to speak to that, please.
Thank you very much. Okay, Tony, you want to talk about that?
Well, in Northern Virginia, a number of the companies almost come to the university and ask that we produce more people in certain fields because they have jobs that are not filled. Yes, a certain type of job is going overseas, and we're losing jobs, yes, but these are computer engineers and people who are building and working for the Defense Department and all sorts of industries that we need. And there is a market for some of their skills.
Okay, let's go right back. Sir, go ahead. Tell us your name and ask your question.
All right, my name is Kyle Schlosek, S-Z-L-O-S-E-K, and you guys were stating that you were looking for a focus for the movement. And if you've noticed, we have occupations all over the world. I mean, we're up to roughly 4,000 locations, and we hit smaller towns every day. It grows every single moment. And it's people who not necessarily don't have jobs, but realize that the system is out of priority. I mean, we aren't worried about the environmental problems when we have the Pacific Rim garbage patch, which is right next to the Ring of Fire. Now, we aren't worried about the landfills and renewing our resources. We aren't worried about sustaining the livability of our planet. And we are worried about trifling things like who's got the better country, or who's got the better government, or we're still arguing about human rights in the biggest networking era ever. I mean, we can contact anybody in the world who has the internet instantly, and we still have trifling things like borders, saying that we own part of this planet when everybody who walks the planet is equal. So I wonder, what is your stance on the position for us to maintain having borders, and what can the occupations do?
I appreciate the question, and just to restate it for those who may not have heard, and I want to ask both of you, in this era of globalization, capital is certainly free to go anywhere in the search of investments and profits, but national borders are separating people, and of course for those who come without documents, they're put into prison and deported. And is the whole idea of the nation state somewhat outmoded in the new era of globalization? Are we entering a new period?
I think the nation state has become the sort of handmaiden to corporations. I mean, it used to be that the state managed corporations through regulations, but now what's happening basically is the state is kind of paving the way for corporations to do what they want to do. So if you look at, a free trade agreement like NAFTA, it is free trade in as much as trade can move across those borders relatively freely, but people cannot move across those borders. So the question is, I think, not whether the nation state is dying. It's not dying. It's changing its role. And when you look at, what can cross the borders and what can't, that is what corporations want, not what necessarily the people want.
So the nation state is at the service of the corporations and banks?
I think so, to a great extent. I mean, we still have the concept of sovereignty. I mean, we can't go into other countries and invade that way, government into government. But it is a regulation of people now, and that's labor, back to the labor issue.
Okay, we're going to take a break in 2 minutes, but sir, I want to get you in a conversation if you could just state your name and ask your question.
My name is Hollis from Occupy Madison, and my question is, with everything that the occupations are doing, why are the American people not getting better informed about the American Legislative Exchange Commission, which was created as a shadow government by George Bush and Dick Cheney at the end of the administration, which is essentially buying off our congressional leaders? And what can we better do about that than just addressing these leaders who are being paid money to look the other way?
Okay, do either of you want to take a stab at that, about the legislative commission that was established by Bush and Cheney that the gentleman feels has kind of hijacked the political process?
I don't feel like I know enough about it to make a specific comment about
I don't
that.
either. I'm not.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question, and we'll ask it when we come back. We're just blocks from K Street, where there's an army of paid lobbyists, and some people think of them as the shadow government. They represent the corporations and banks. But we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. Okay. That was the...
Okay.
Welcome back to 2.5 Hours. We're here in Freedom Plaza, just 13 blocks from the U.S. Capitol building. 2 blocks to our west is the White House. And of course, right here, we're with the people who have been occupying Washington, D.C. since October 6th, demanding social justice, economic equality, and are part of a broad, sweeping movement around the country. We're joined here in Freedom Plaza by Carolyn Gallagher. She's with American University, a professor, and Tony Travis of George Mason University, and of course by the participants of the encampment here in Freedom Plaza. We are having great input and feedback from people, questions. We're talking about this new movement, contrasting it with the movement of the 1960s for social justice and civil rights, the movement of the 1930s for the labor movement principally. I want to come back and ask about something that is obviously a big issue in New York, in Chicago, in Oakland, and that has to do with the question of police repression and police violence. Here at the Freedom Plaza, the National Park Service extended a permit for 4 months, an unprecedented action, allowing people to stay. But in Oakland, they opened fire and shot an Iraq war veteran in the head. In Zuccotti Park and the Brooklyn Bridge, hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 have been arrested. Many encampments have been shut down. Do you think the U.S. government is involved in some sort of coordinated effort, Carolyn, to use police repression to shut down this movement?
Well, I wouldn't say the federal government's doing that, but I think you really have to go city by city to see how different police officers or different sort of police forces are handling the movement. And I also would want to say, you want to be careful. And I think the Occupy movements, I've seen people say this, the Occupy movements want to be careful in their dealings with the police because in a sense, you want them on your side. I mean, if you think about the Arab Spring, the military refused to do what Mubarak asked, and they actually were on the side of the people. So, the police are not automatically the enemy, although certainly when they abuse protesters, they should be held to account for that.
That's what I meant a little bit about focus. I mean, if you go back to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King picked his targets in his cities very strategically. Here we're dealing with hundreds of local governments now, and the police are not trained necessarily to deal with demonstrators in each of these places. Maybe in a couple of the major cities, but not a lot of them.
Well, the protesters certainly in Oakland and New York say that there is systematic police repression. Clearly, that hasn't been the case uniformly across the board. But in some cities, New York has 43,000 police. That's bigger than most countries' armies. In the case of Oakland, there have been repeated assaults against peaceful demonstrators. The question I'm wondering is, if the police tactic keeps going, as it appears to be in numerous cities, will this lead to some kind of political transformation of the movement? In other words, at first people were chanting, the police are part of the 99%, but of course if you're getting shot with rubber bullets and pepper spray and tear gas, your impressions will change. What do you think about that?
Well, I think if you look at the situation in New York and when the protesters were sort of pulled onto the Brooklyn Bridge and then they were boxed off on both ends by the police and arrested, that's a huge problem. But I would put that on Michael Bloomberg, and I think in a lot of respects that blows back on him and makes him look bad. So I actually think when the police overreact, they do in some respects the movement a favor. Now, obviously the guy in Oakland who was severely wounded, no one did him a favor. But when the police overreact, all they do is make people think, well, maybe these guys are onto something. The people that are sitting in their living rooms not sort of participating.
Yes, I've noticed.
Not that I want the police to do that. I mean, you don't want police to beat people up to help your movement. But if they're doing that, it certainly doesn't hurt the movement.
Well, we're gonna go back and talk to people here in Freedom Plaza who are part of this occupation. I want to say, though, as we do that, and I'm going to call on you, is that in the case of Oakland, after Scott Olson, the Iraq war veteran, was shot in the head with a tear gas canister, the whole port of Oakland was shut down with a massive general strike, the first protest like that since 1946. So it seems to have the opposite. If the intended effect was to intimidate people,
it didn't.
It seemed to galvanize more support. Ma'am, can you state your name and ask your question?
My name's Brittany Gedritis. I'm from Connecticut. We talked about student loans and the people having debt, basically. I want to know why corporations don't get 15,000 calls a day saying, why don't you pay back what you owe? Like oil companies owe Valdez, Alaska, $5 billion for the last 15 years and have not paid a cent. BP owes people down south billions and billions of dollars and have not been questioned about it for a second. They'll give you $5,000 to sign away your right to sue, and that's it. And his office is right down there that said that, 2 blocks away.
Let me just ask you, you're from Connecticut,
yeah.
And just because part of our audience is
I live here now.
Is an international audience.
I get
when you say
calls a day.
the BP and the banks are not being called, you mean students are being called by creditors?
My brother gets calls from UConn University. My dad gets calls from 15 different credit card companies. I get calls from hospitals that I owe money to, and my father's been unemployed for 6 years. I've been unemployed for a while. My brother can't find a job that pays more than minimum wage, and he has a college degree. There's something wrong with our country, and the people responsible are not doing anything.
Thank you for that. I want to ask both of you to comment. That's a poignant point that when low-income people, unemployed people can't pay their debt, they're hounded by creditors and credit agencies, and yet these big banks and corporations seem to operate with impunity. You think that's the perception?
I think that's perception and the reality for a lot of people. I think that when the tactics get honed and sharpened, the corporations will be a direct target, and people will learn how to disrupt their meetings, their corporate meetings, as well as their shareholder meetings. That's what hurts them. They can't stand that, or to have a protest when you're supposed to sign off on these things and just agree to whatever the corporations are doing, and you say no.
Carolyn, Tony's painting the specter of the protest being not only in the streets but also in the boardrooms where investors and the board of directors meet. Do you see that? Do you see that coming based on what the young woman's comments were?
I think it could happen, and I think it's long overdue. But I would also want to go back to the debt issue that was raised. You know, a lot of times when you hear about people that are into debt, the sort of automatic response is, well, they were prolific spenders and they were overspending. A huge number of people every year go into debt because of medical issues. They basically have something happen, their health insurance either drops them or it doesn't cover them completely, and they're left with an enormous bill, in the 6 figures, and they simply cannot pay that back. They have jobs, they have families, they have houses, they have mortgages. They are what we would typically consider a contributing member of society, and those debts can destroy them. And we need a system where those kinds of debts and the circumstances where people get into those kinds of debts should not destroy people. It's in nobody's interest to decimate families, to put them on the street, to put them into dangerous situations. It's not helping anybody. It doesn't help our country. I mean, I always say to people, do you want to walk down a street and you have thousands of people on the street that are homeless with tuberculosis and other communicable diseases, or do you want to help people and get them into housing and get them where they're in a better shape? I mean, sometimes I feel like people want this country to be a third world country. They want to punish all of these people, and they want them to be, in such bad straits that I think that our streets would look very different if we actually did what a lot of the sort of right wing wants to do.
I think most people would be, internationally, who don't live here, would be shocked to learn that in this record number of bankruptcies in the last year, half of the people who declared bankruptcy, or more than half, declared it because they couldn't pay doctors' bills. I mean, that's a shocking statistic. I want to bring the next gentleman in who's here in Freedom Plaza. Your name, sir?
Yes, my name is Gregory Hicks, and I'm from the Midwest, but I've been here in Washington, D.C. for the last 4 years. I've been doing a one-man occupation in front of the Justice Department for almost 3 years. I joined this occupation last night. And I'd like to dovetail off of what you were saying. I believe that one of the biggest problems in the world right now, in this country and internationally, is accountability. I think that, because you talked about the civil rights movement, I'm 54 years old, I'm old enough to remember all of that stuff, and this is not just about basic human rights for African Americans. You see a broad spectrum of people in various situations around the country and around the world protesting. And I think it has to do with the fact that people have their eyes open. politicians and governments may have guns, they may have armies, they may have secret police, they may have all of that. Then the people on Capitol Hill may have they take all these oaths and they have the power. But just because they have rulership over us doesn't mean that there aren't people in society that can think and can see. And so the accountability issues, you talked about the bailouts and all those things are so outrageous to Americans, to any normal civilized person, that it's a wonder that we don't have more people out here now, and I believe that we will. Like on that, one of the seven, I'll get to my question in just a second, but the 7 points that we have here at the Occupy Freedom Plaza, the nonviolent freedom movement, I'm not going to do all of them, but I just go down to the very last one.
Go ahead, do it quickly.
Get money out of politics. Now, in my personal situation, I have been gassed, sexually violated. Terrible things have been done to me right in front of the Justice Department of the United States of America in my one-man occupation, and no one's done anything. And every time there seems to be some help coming and some kind of recognition of the situation, it gets squashed from the top down. So this accountability issue and this ability to buy and to rig anything you want, and that's one of the things. So the question is, when you talk about government being rigged for the benefit of the corporation, there's also a question that I have about how big do you see the problem of being that elected officials are rigging the entire system, not just to protect their corporate sponsors, but to protect them when they are guilty, when they do wrong.
Thank you very much. That was very well stated, and I appreciate it. There's the revolving door in Washington, which I think Mr. Hicks was referring to, that public officials not only work on behalf of corporations when they're in office, but many times leave public office and become the paid operatives of those same corporations, and that's what I meant by K Street. How big of an issue is that?
Jack Abramoff, one of our biggest lobbyists who went to jail, was just released, and he made the point that if we had a law and enforced that law, that anyone who works on the Hill, staff and or elected official, could not become a lobbyist, you might stop part of the problem. Because it is that revolving door. You're on the Hill for a few years, you go out and then lobby for legislation that you know about and staff members you worked with.
I want to ask you, Carolyn, about one of the revolving doors, and that's people coming out of the Pentagon and going directly into Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Grumman, what was called Blackwater. In other words, military corporations that are, while there's some reductions in the amount of growth for the defense budget, that's not being cut. It's going up every year. It's almost when you look at the entire budget, it's almost $1 trillion. Do you think that this movement for social justice is making the connection to the military budget?
I think it is, and I mean that's one of the sort of things on the 7 planks that the Occupy DC gave us. I mean, and just to sort of go back to the larger issue that was going on this summer about the budget debate, when you look at what the two parties were arguing about in terms of what to cut, it was a very, very, very small slice of what is known as discretionary spending, and they were ignoring huge parts of that, of the budget, and one of those parts of the budget is military spending.
I mean, when you look at the U.S. government discretionary budget, meaning not entitlements, not Social Security, right, not Medicare, not Medicaid, it's about 1 out of every $2 goes for defense or for interest payments related to defense. Do you see this merging into a kind of a new peace movement as well? I mean, there is the war in Afghanistan, the drone attacks on Pakistan, which are intensifying. There was just the bombing of Libya. Iraq is winding down perhaps, but not the private contractors will stay.
I mean, I think I don't think it's becoming a peace movement. I mean, I think peace is what people want, but what people want is, again, to go back to this issue of corporations and who's getting the money that our country is producing. And what they want to see is the money going to the people. not to Blackwater, now Z, or these other contractors. It's not that we don't want a defense of the country. I think most people do. But the question is how much of the money that we produce as our GDP is going to go to fund military versus all of these other things that we think are very important.
Go ahead, Tony.
And if we end the wars and bring the troops home, the bigger issue, I think, is jobs. I think it's all tied, as the old military-industrial complex phrase says. I mean, where are these people going to go back into the economy? Are they trained for jobs? I mean, we do not want another situation as we had when the Vietnam vets came back and we didn't care and we didn't try to integrate them back into society in a meaningful way.
Yeah, unemployment is a lot higher for returning vets than it is for the population as a whole.
I think the number is about 30% of returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans are unemployed. And the other thing that's interesting is that in 2007, before the recession started, the Pentagon couldn't meet its recruiting goals. But then once everyone was unemployed, they had more people signing up than they ever had. In other words, they were joining for economic reasons, and yet today so many are unemployed. I want to ask, and if anybody here wants to speak to it as well, about the participation of returning Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans in the movement, because you can see that coming around the country. But ma'am, identify yourself and ask your question.
I'm Bridget Mugane from Columbia, Maryland, and I'd like to get your comments on the changing role of seniors. I remember the Second World War personally, incidentally. The age for eligibility for Social Security is going up. I think it's up to 67. When I went on, it was 65. I think it's supposed to go to 70. And means we have to work longer. I'm okay with it, but there are a lot of people who aren't physically up to it. I'm contributing to my three grandchildren's college education right now, which is compromising my nest egg because I don't have a pension from an employer, and most people no longer have pensions. So we have kind of a pincher movement with the elderly. We have to work longer, but our nest egg is being taken away, and we don't have pensions other than Social Security, which averages $15,000 a year. With Medicare, just very quickly, I've been turned away from two doctors' firms on the basis that they will no longer accept new patients with Medicare. Mm-hmm. And if that agreement is kept between Obama and the Congress, that they would actually cut the amount paid to physicians who now drive Hondas and Mazdas, no more, Rolls Royces and Cadillacs. They're going to take it. They're just going to stop accepting Medicare. So we're kind of in a squeeze here, and I haven't heard that discussed at all. and wondered what your comments might be.
Thank you so much. But before you leave the mic, let me ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
This movement has been characterized around the country as predominantly a movement of young people, but you're obviously not a young person. You're a formerly young person. And you remember World War II. How long have you been here? How long are you coming intermittently, or have you stayed throughout?
The occupation, I'm not living here, but I have contributed to the Occupy, October 2011 Occupy, to the Washington, D.C. Occupy, and to the Wall Street Occupy. I'm giving money, let's put it that way, and I brought 24 hard-boiled eggs this morning.
Excellent.
For lunch.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Carolyn and Tony.
I think the silent majority are our senior citizens. I mean, when I teach lobbying and interest group politics, AARP is only going to go up, American Associations for Retired Persons, in membership numbers, because that's the baby boomers are getting to that age. I mean, if they mobilize, we have a serious movement.
Carolyn, and people are affirming that. Carolyn, you want to jump in on that?
Well, I think entitlement, entitlement spending is a big issue, and we know that it's going to balloon as a part of the federal budget over the next coming years because we have the baby boom generation getting older. But again, the question that the debate has been so narrow to, we have to cut Social Security, how much do we have to cut it? And I think that eliminates a lot of options for dealing with the elderly population. And again, I don't think anybody wants to see a city or a town where you have elderly people living on the street. And so cutting Social Security is simply not an option.
the number of elderly people in poverty has gone way up, and the new reports out today show that you know, it's across the board throughout the country. Sir, if you could jump in, you're here again in Freedom Plaza, your name and your question.
My name is Bill Hamilton, and I'm from St. Augustine, Florida. And the point that I would like to make is that in his book, Blessed Unrest, Paul Hawken identified what he called the largest social movement in the history of the world. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of organizations internationally coming together to identify social justice, environmental justice, and indigenous justice issues. My question to you is, do you see this Occupy movement as a synthesis of all of those uncentralized movements that have taken leadership from those three movements? Do you see that as this Occupy movement as a coming together?
Okay, so let me thank you very much. Let me just rephrase it for everyone too, so that is it a synthesis of already existing movements, or is it a spontaneous movement that's a catalyst that helps bring some of those movements to the fore?
I think it's a new movement, but I think that it's attractive to some of these older or existing sort of areas of concern. But I think it's its own unique sort of movement. And again, I keep going back to the Great Recession and the fact, this movement did not happen during the recession. It happened at the point when the recession should be over, and it was clear to everyone that it wasn't over, and it wasn't going to be over, and may not be over for many more years. So I feel like it is a unique sort of movement, and it is about, it's coming out of the recession and about the sense that corporate greed has won out over everyday people. However, again, all you have to do is go to any of the Occupy movements. There are lots of people with diverse interests and issues, and that's not a bad thing, nor is it necessarily a strange thing. I mean, if you went to the Tea Party rallies a couple of years ago, they had people that were super socially conservative and also libertarians who want the government out of their bedrooms no matter what. So, I mean, you know, it's not unusual for a movement to have a variety of sort of interest in it.
Tony?
I think it's built on the other movements, the environmental, social justice movements. And I think, as she says, it is unique. I don't think we'll know quite what it is or where it's going yet. I think we'll know in a few months. I think it's going to solidify.
Okay, let's go back. Sir, your name and your question.
My name is Ben Reynolds. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee. Y'all seem extremely well educated and well informed. Thank you. My question is, if you see what we see and you feel how we feel, do you need a tent?
Okay, so there's an open invitation for everyone to become part of the encampment. And I don't know if you need to respond to that, but you said, Carolyn, that you have been at the Occupy DC movement. I myself have been able to go to Chicago and New York and Los Angeles and see what's going on. And to go back, I think that we also feel that while there's not uniformity of opinion and certainly not a defined leadership, many different sectors of people who may not be normally involved in political activism are very sympathetic to this movement and looking to join in. Do you think that's accurate?
I think that's the case. I mean, for example, I have a handicapped husband, so I couldn't come down here, but I should be doing more and could be doing more.
Carolyn?
Well, I brought my one-year-old to the McPherson Square Occupy DC. It's not not the one in Freedom Plaza, and he had a little 99% sign. So he was not sure he knew what he was holding, but he enjoyed it.
So your one-year-old is not part of the 1%; he's part of the 99%.
Yeah.
Very good.
No, I mean I appreciate that. It's really nice to be invited. Very much.
Okay, sir, your name and your question.
My name's Bevan Tremblay. I live in California. I'm here visiting President West Virginia, and I've been following the movement from afar, and I want to come here and see the people in person. And so I'm absolutely blessed to be here. Thank you so much for all of this. And so if we are agreed that money is the mother's milk of politics, how, I mean, if we need an issue and we have to prioritize, what's number one?
Okay, so I'll ask both of you, and if there's anyone else who is trying to speak, you should take the mic. But money is the dominant factor in politics. Certainly in the coming presidential election, there will be $2 billion spent between the two rivals, the Republicans and the Democrats. Not too many people can come up with that kind of money. I would guess that you would agree that that sort of is a dominant issue.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the movement, I think, actually should sort of take two tracks that are parallel, and they're under the same sort of umbrella, which is sort of alternative ways of being. And I think that this is an alternative way of being and saying we're not going to take it anymore. But the larger problem is that there's the structure. Here we are in the axis here between the White House and Congress, and these are the people that appropriate the money. These are the people that take all of the money that comes in from your tax dollars and gets distributed in the country. So at some point, the movement is going to have to deal with politicians, and the big worry for me is that it gets co-opted. I don't want it to get co-opted by people that want to sort of turn it into their own vehicle.
We only have less than a minute and a half, so I want to ask one last question here, sir. Your name and your question.
Hello, I'm Jake Aiken from West Virginia, and I'm a philosopher. I observe man's doings.
We have very brief. What's your question?
Okay. Man has chosen religion, complicated economic structure, and governments and politics to rule and dictate their lives for centuries. And will there ever be a day when man chooses love before all? Because all of the things we have tried in the past have left entire groups of people
because
out.
we have less than a minute, I'm going to give you each a shot. Is it, in other words, a new kind of ethos, a new kind of values that are could dominate political life?
It could, but I don't think we'll get there.
Okay. And what about you, Carolyn?
I like to be hopeful.
Yeah.
I like to be hopeful.
Well, certainly one of the characteristic features of this movement is a new hopefulness, a new idealism. In that sense, it's something very comparable to what happened in the 60s and the 1930s. This concludes this episode of 2.5 Hours. We're here at Freedom Plaza. I want to thank all the people here. I want to thank our two guests, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.